So as part of the adding holds to a climbing wall series, I've been playing around with making some volumes. And I think this is something that home walls tend to lack perhaps, and I found that they've added a huge amount of variety and ability to set small and large holds in a new way, and also a really interesting way of changing the wall shape and providing some interesting routes around them. Now, volumes I don't think are so great for if you have a sort of spray wall style setup where you have a single set of holds that you don't change very often. But if you are resetting frequently, which is sort of how I would recommend using a home wall, because setting is so much good fun, the volumes really add a huge amount of options and of fantastic routes, and also the ability to take small holds and make them nice or different is really fantastic. So in this video I'm going to start by going through why you might want some volumes in terms of setting options, as a start with, sort of go through the different types of volumes, and then go through, I think, the major difficulties and challenges in terms of making your own volumes. Now, volumes are fairly cheap to buy, and there are lots of suppliers like, say, Holds, that are selling them for perhaps £30 to £50 per volume. And certainly if you don't have the tools to make a volume kind of already lying about, then those are very cost effective and really, I think, are worthwhile in terms of making a small selection of holds go a lot further, and I think actually they're a really cost effective way of increasing your setting possibilities. But if you already have the tools for them, they're a fantastically fun project to make, and also they are quite a lot cheaper, and particularly if you want a lot of volumes, once you've got those patterns and those processes laid out, they really come together very quickly. Now, having said that, I think there are two main challenges in making volumes, and one, and I think the one that's really inaccessible, is how to take a design that you have in your mind and go through to a pattern to cut. And I'll talk about some thoughts and some considerations and some techniques in this video, but I think I'm going to go through a really detailed example of this in a different video, because it's actually quite a long-winded process that I've spent a lot of time trying to get right and still make mistakes with, so I think I'm going to do that separately. Once you have the pattern, I think cutting the pieces are fairly easy, and how to assemble them is fairly straightforward. And then there's some interesting notes on how to finish them, and some considerations about the design. So let's go straight on to what purposes do volumes have on the wall. Now that might seem like a really obvious question, what purpose do volumes have on the wall, but actually I've been thinking about it quite a lot in terms of kind of why they're useful and why they're worth putting effort into. And so the first one is kind of the obvious one, that you're changing the shape of the wall, and it can be very easy to get a single, even quite small volume and shape all of the climbs around that volume. So if you've got something sticking out from the wall, you really have to navigate round it as a climber, or under it, or over it. And that sort of change of the climbing flow can do a huge amount into how the wall feels. And particularly, if you have a single sort of panel of wall, then adding volumes can make a huge difference. And I think nowhere is this more obvious than, say, on a vertical wall, where you can force a move around a volume, and that can be the defining feature of a huge number of routes and a huge variety. That can also make them quite frustrating to set with as well. The second one is to change the slope of the wall, and so this might be turning a vertical into a slab for a local area, or it might be adding a really overhung section, or as we've used them also, if you've got a roof section, it can really help make that roof area a little bit more usable. And that brings me on to the modification of holds. So this might be small screw-ons, it might be pretty boring holds, it might be slopers that are just a bit too hard for an overhung section of wall. They modify the angle of the wall effectively for the holds, and so it's not a difference in climbing style, it's just a modification of the holds. And that can be really fantastic if, for instance, you have a lot of small holds, maybe a lot of crimps. That means that you don't have any sort of slopers with an open hand position, but say rotate the crimp around and put it on a volume, and you've got yourself quite a good sloper there. And that can be really helpful if you have a small stock of quite small holds. And the final one is a sort of more modern style of setting, where you use the volumes either directly or just with some screw-ons as holds themselves. and particularly for feet and for yeah, as I said, this kind of more modern style of setting, that's really exciting. And they can be really good fun in setting yourself what feels like very futuristic climbs, and they can be very aesthetic with the volumes. So I think those are the four main uses of volumes. There also may be an argument that you can extend a wall with volumes, so perhaps put them on an arête and it allows more usable area. Or for the bigger volumes, just adding something sticking out from the wall actually increases the climbing surface quite a lot. And it might just be a good way of adding more bolt holes. In terms of shapes coming from the uses, I think you have a few categories. You have low-profile shapes that are useful to slightly modify holds, mostly, say, foot holds. We've not had a huge luck of them modifying handholds significantly. You have a classic pyramid shape that can both be a hold, it can modify holds, and it locally changes the slope of the wall to some extent, but it doesn't really provide the climbing flow. And then you have hold-like shapes, so these are things with that might act as a sort of pinch rail or other shapes like that. And then you have sort of bigger volumes that mostly are there to modify the flow of the climbing around them, and less so to modify the holds themselves, because you'll usually be sort of climbing on that slope, and so the hold modification doesn't matter so much. So it's a little bit nondescript, but I think the best volumes to make in terms of bang for buck are simple pyramid volumes, and also perhaps volumes that can provide some amount of hold capacity, but not perfect holds on their own, because that makes setting actually quite challenging. If you have a volume that's good enough to be used on a hold on its own, that dominates the setting for that whole thing. Whereas if you have something that's a bit harder to use directly, you can either use it directly as a hold for a harder route, or it allows you a place to put holds on for easier routes and a variety of routes as well. So first of all, let's just talk quickly about what do we need to know out of this process. As I say, the pattern of the wood you're going to cut, that's pretty obvious, but there's this edge angle thing, and I'm probably going to have to draw some stuff on the whiteboard to explain this. Okay, so there are two ways of joining plywood. You have a simple butt joint, which is the most obvious, I think, where you have just a 90-degree cut on both sides, in the case of a 90-degree joint, and you just sort of either screw it together like this. But the major flaw with this is that you have this end grain open on this side, and that means that when you apply force on this way, you're going to delaminate it. It means that your screw's going through at a slightly odd angle compared to the ply, and generally you're also going to get voids on this edge usually, unless your ply is very good, and that's going to be harder to fill, and also going to make this edge just a bit of a pain. The other way of doing it, which I much prefer when I can, is to join ply this way. So it's edge to edge, and you've cut quite a steep bevel on each of these sides. And that means that this corner is very uniform, you can get a really nice tight fit on it, and also when you kind of round it off you get a nice even rounding, and generally I found these are very good, and then you drop a screw through there. It also means you get a nice glue joint on this edge, which is really helpful. However, there are some limitations to this. At least my saw can only cut a bevel of 50 degrees, and because you are joining two pieces where you have quite a steep angle here, that limits you to cutting only an angle of, say, 80 degrees between the two pieces, which is fine if you're doing the flatter shapes, but as you get more aggressive, this can be a real limiting factor. The other advantage of this is that all of your pieces can be the same size because they meet evenly at the same point, and this makes pattern making very easy because really you're cutting, assuming that your bevel's always going in to the piece, you're cutting just the shape of the outside that you want, and that means that if, for instance, you made a paper pattern or you've got a 3D model, you can just take those dimensions directly, whereas with a technique like this, you have one side that's bigger by the width of the ply and one side that's smaller by the width of the ply, and that can be quite a headache. However, you've got this limitation of angle, and also this limitation of cutting these steep bevels, in terms of, for instance, if you had a jigsaw, that would be quite a lot harder. If you're doing it by hand, it would be quite a lot harder. And generally, it feels quite a lot less easy to cut them with a very steep angle. So you are really limited to like 90 degrees or maybe 80-degree angles, and you really can't get a shape that's more like this, where it's much more pointy, because if you can imagine, these start to be, say, like 30 degrees, and you just can't cut that with a saw. So my technique when I'm designing these things is to mix the two as much as possible, and particularly I try and get these edge-to-edge joints as much as possible and minimise the butt joints to where they're only strictly necessary. And so, for instance, if I was making a shape with one edge like this, and then some other edges, I would do this one with a butt joint, but let's just imagine for a second that we have another little angle here. I would do this one with an edge-to-edge joint. And that's because for this, say, that might only be a 30-degree bevel cut, whereas this angle here is, say, 70 degrees, and so it would require some very, very sharp angles to cut that, and I can't do it. So I'm going to just make these a butt joint, and that means that my pattern layout's a little bit more complicated, but most of the joints are going to be this nice style of joint, and it's just going to be where I really can't avoid it. The other thing to consider is where the volume meets the wall. Obviously, you have to have a nice snug fit here, and I'm just going to draw an example, like a cross-section through a volume. Say I had a really flat volume like this. I'm going to want a foot on the volume, like this, and actually this angle here is very challenging to cut if it's less than 45. So if I've got a volume that is at this angle, it's very easy, but as soon as it gets super flat, it's actually quite challenging to cut. One solution to this, and again this makes pattern layout harder, is instead of doing it with this way, would be to have it cut like this. And so here you don't have the nice area contact. You might put, say, a block behind here to help reinforce that screw. But you do have a nice taper for the climbing surface, so you don't have an abrupt 90-degree edge, because if you have an abrupt 90-degree edge, it's effectively quite a good hold. So there's all these considerations to do, and what I've found is that, you know, even though I think through these things quite a lot, I'm unusual to get it right first time. And I think there's some advantage in perhaps making a foam pattern first, just to get a feel for the shape, and to think about these angles, to think about these angles, and to think about these angles, and to think about attachment methods, and really feel confident in what you're doing before you start cutting it, because I found it quite frustrating once you started cutting things to be getting them wrong. So I've kind of alluded to your options in terms of how you might find the patterns and the edge angles for these things, and I think I see it in two different camps. You have one camp where you make a model of what you want to do, or for instance you have a volume already that you want to copy, and then you model it up maybe in foam core, maybe in card, and then you measure the angles using protractor and an angle marking type jig, and you measure the shapes and possibly even describe them directly onto the material, and you think about those angles that I've talked about. And then the other technique would be to model it up in CAD, and I've been trying to do that, but it's very challenging, and then from that directly measure angles and distances off those. Now, the workflow that I've built up is to use Blender, because I'm very familiar with it, and then use the Papercraft add-on, which gives you the patterns all laid out flat, and then exporting as an SVG and kind of measuring those. It's a bit of a pain, and then using edge distances with the Measure It add-on, and sort of hand drawing the patterns from them. However, I found this pretty error prone, to be honest. I've made quite a lot of mistakes, and I find it still quite difficult to conceptualize the harder shapes, and particularly when you start getting to butt joints mixed with these edge-to-edge joints, it actually gets really challenging. But there's an easy option if you want to make just some simple volumes, and I think these are the pyramid volumes, which have just a 90-degree angle on a triangle, and actually are very hard to get wrong because they have sort of no critical measurements. And so basically what you're doing is you're cutting 3 90-degree identical triangles out, and you are just sticking them together in a particular way. And I think that this is a really nice way of quickly making volumes. We made 5 of them in a couple of hours one afternoon, and I think that's fantastic because you can just have a stock of volumes. They're usable you can bash them out and there's no worry about measurement. So my top tip for these is to cut a piece of ply with the same bevel on each side. And this seems a little counterintuitive to start with, but you'll see how it all works. So you cut a strip of ply, and I had it 17.6 centimetres wide, and that made a volume that I think is quite a nice size. So then we got a long strip with our bevels like this, and then you cut one cut like this, and then this angle is 45 degrees, so you can use a simple I've got a square with a 45-degree edge on it, so that was really, really quick to set up. And you do it with a 45-degree bevel on the saw. And then, using where this joins here, you cut another, so that's 45, with the bevel going this way. And so you have a piece with a bevel going down on this side, down on this side, down on this side, so it should just be a nice triangle with no bevels visible. And then you recut this edge with the bevel going this way. So again, just making sure that it's underneath the piece. So all this time, you shouldn't be seeing a bevel face up when you're cutting a final cut. And then again, you just measure another 45 here, and you cut it so that the bevel goes this way. So again, you've got another piece with it down. And this gives you 2 identical pieces, and you can just carry on doing that. Each time you've got a shared edge, you have to recut it. And that's a bit of a pain, but on the plus side, you waste very little material, because in the end you just end up with scrap that looks like this. It's sort of, 20 centimetres long and is a little tiny triangle, and you can just bin it, and that's very little material lost. Both bevels going down, and then all of these bevels going down, and you're just recutting the same edge over and over again. And I think that is the best way to make these things. A hole here and a hole here to screw the whole thing together. So I think the final things to talk about is just some construction and finishing tips. And these are just kind of my experiences, and I think there's a lot of scope for improving them. So I've mostly been using a handheld circular saw for it. I've been using like a DeWalt battery powered saw. It works really, really well. Not that specific brand, but the circular saw idea in general I find really good. If you had a table saw, it would be much better. I think you could do it with a beveling jigsaw, and also the pyramid ones you could technically do without any sort of beveling at all, but it would probably be less robust. And so, don't let a lack of tools put you off. You could also cut them with your with a handsaw, but that probably would get tiresome very quickly. And of course, you'll need a drill and things to sort of assemble them. To be honest, if you're going out to buy tools to do this, you're fairly unlikely to make your money back off them unless you're making a lot of volumes. But perhaps if you're making your own climbing wall anyway, you might well have quite a lot of these tools. I think the next question is how to actually assemble them, and I found this quite a frustrating and laborious and messy process. Because I wanted to glue and screw them together. It's a classic construction method, and it's very quick to put together because you don't have to sit around waiting for glue to dry all clamped up. Particularly when you've got these weird shapes, they're very, very challenging to clamp. So screws, I feel, are a necessity to put them together, and it also provides quite a lot of comfort to not have to worry about your glue joints. So I generally glued and screwed them together. Now, some people put backers behind the joints, like pieces of wood that fit nice and snugly behind the joints, and then they might well rely on glue only. And I think that's probably a good idea for the bigger volumes. They're called strong backs, maybe. And that might really help them make them more robust. However, at least for the small volumes, I don't think that that's particularly necessary, although, I don't hold any responsibility to your volumes breaking, but I think, 18mm ply, which is what I'm using, definitely recommend 18mm ply, is really strong when glued and screwed together. You make really strong joints, and all it really requires is that you spend a bit of care to make sure that your angles aren't way off, and that you use a decent wood glue. I might recommend a foaming polyurethane glue, because that'll fill the gaps a bit more effectively and give you a bit more leeway. I've just been using a non-foaming glue, and that works okay, but I definitely could see a bit of gap filling capability might be really helpful. One thing for assembly with the glue and screw is I would very thoroughly recommend getting a countersinking drill bit. So this is a drill bit that's got a normal twist drill in it, but with a countersink sort of up the shank. And that gives you a nice place for the heads of the screws to live, sort of underneath the surface of the ply, and also saves you having to change drill bits at all. That also allows you to give a nice place to just put some filler over the screw heads, and that means that your volumes end up looking a lot more professional. I have tried using masking tape or perhaps duct tape in assembly. It sort of worked a little bit, but really the process that I would go with was to try and screw them together first, and completely ignore the glue, do a dry fit. Once they're screwed together, unscrew them, and then glue them together, because the glue just makes everything slide around and is a nightmare. The alternative route you could go is to glue them together first and then put screws in, and I tried that for a more complex shape of volume that I had, that were taking a long time to screw together. I sort of set them up on my desk with some heavy objects around them so it couldn't really move, glued it together and then screwed it, and that worked also quite well. But the combination of the two is a real nightmare, so I wouldn't try and do both at once. If you're going for the quickest solution, I think it's to screw first. The next step after you've glued and screwed them, you've let them dry, is you give them a really good sand on the edges. You want the edges to be slightly rounded. You can cover up a magnitude of sins with a bit of sanding, a bit of filler. I used normal wood filler. I'd probably recommend something like Bondo, or a sort of harder epoxy or car body type filler. The wood filler is a little bit friable, not very robust to sort of use on the wall. So that's one thing that I might improve in the future. Part of the design is to get the T-nut holes in, and obviously you can do volumes without T-nut holes, and a lot of volumes I think make sense not to have T-nut holes in them. But one thing, if you are going to put T-nut holes in, you need to make sure that they're in a place where you can get holds on, because if you've got quite a small volume, actually a lot of your holds just won't fit on the volume. And it might be a good idea when you're trying to lay out where the holes go to actually get a couple of your holds out and try putting them on the sides of the volume, and work out where the placement would best be. One other thing to consider, particularly with the flatter volumes, is that the bolt will actually stick through and potentially all the way through the depth of the volume and hit the wall. And so you'll either need to find a shorter bolt in that case, or you just won't be able to drive a hold. And then finally, you've got to put some holes to actually screw them to the wall. This is obviously fairly self-explanatory. I think a countersinking drill works quite well, but I would fairly heavily recommend putting in washers in those holes, because it will make them a lot longer lived, and particularly if your drill's clutch isn't so good, you could easily blow out those attachment points, and that'd be a real shame, because it would mean you'd have to put some more in, or you'd be ruining your volume. So it's always worth maybe putting some inserts in those holes. So I think the final thing to consider while making volumes is the finishing, and this is something that we've sort of gone round and round on to try and find different ways, partly while we were building the walls, and partly while we were doing the volumes. And so our first approach was to use the sort of a floor paint, say not a garage floor paint, but just an ordinary floor paint, which is surprisingly hard to source, and particularly in colours that you might actually like. We managed to find white floor paint, and we managed to find grey floor paint, and definitely you can find red floor paint. We would often do a coat of something, and then a coat of sand, and then a coat of something, and a coat of something over the top perhaps, so maybe 3 coats. And I've played around with using an ordinary household sample can, which are obviously very cheap and you can get in lots of nice bright colours very cheaply. A coat of that, a coat of paving sand. You really want to use paving sand because it's really nice and fine and dry and goes on very evenly, and then you brush it off lightly once it's dried, and then another coat of the coloured paint. I might water it down a little bit so it doesn't go on too thick, and then a coat of your sort of final layers paints over the top. I have tried floor varnish mixed with a bit of the household paint, and that seems to work really well. We haven't tested them for longevity hugely yet, but I'm really positive about that technique because I think it provides a nice colour. It also provides a very robust finish because you've got a nice floor finish. And what's really nice is you get that freedom of colour very cheaply because it's very cheap to buy paint samples or perhaps like a set of acrylics. You know, that's a very cheap way of buying paint rather than floor paints that tend to be very expensive. I think the real way of doing it, if you were trying to do it properly, would be to skip all the silly single part paints and go to a 2-part garage floor paint or a 2-part epoxy paint system. And that is what all commercial volumes will be coated with. I personally dislike non-water-based paints because I am lazy and I don't want to clean up. But I think if you were making a whole set of volumes and you wanted them to really last well and to have good texture, a 2-part garage floor paint would be the way to go, or a 2-part paint system generally. And you can colour those fairly easily with particular types of paints and dyes, and it's not hugely expensive. You know, the paints are not very expensive, but it's mostly just a bit of a pain, and obviously you kind of have to dispose of a load of things like brushes and rollers after you've used them because you can't really effectively clean them off. So for a home wall, I'm not sure I'd particularly bother going with the 2-part, but it's something to consider. One thing I have played around with is doing dual texture volumes, and this can be really interesting if you're trying to use them directly as holds. And particularly for footholds, and you want a bit more root setting flexibility, is that you can choose to put sand only on bits of the hold, and therefore you can alter the texture. And so the way I would do this is when you do that first layer of paint to put sand directly on, and that's how you get sand to stick on, is just to do that on a single part of the hold, probably mask it off. And I think finally, you know, when you have quite a lot of volumes, you can actually start thinking about sets based entirely on volumes, and that can be really exciting. And particularly, you know, perhaps if you're in a big reset day and you're getting a lot of cyc, you can set some really cool routes that are only up temporarily with just volumes. And I think that's the cool thing, actually, about home walls and about adding this flexibility to your home wall set, is that you can do stuff with them that approaches what you could experience with bouldering gym. At the moment, you know, access to bouldering gyms is less easy, but also the ability to learn to set on your own terms is really cool. I've sort of talked about this before. It's really powerful to be able to examine climbing from that other angle, rather than just engaging with it as a consumer, starting to think about designing movement and dictating to the climber what they should be doing. Really helps route reading, really helps the feeling of movement, really helps, I think, the kind of engagement with the climbing process and appreciation of a good setter rather than your own setting as well. So I hope this was generally helpful, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm going to do, as I said, a video on specifics of designing volumes, and yeah, generally please ask any questions that you have below, and I hope you enjoyed. So I think finally I'm just going to add some quick thoughts about setting. It's really important to set well generally, and I think it's something that is not particularly well described in the current literature. And so the key thing to do when you're setting volumes, and particularly volumes that are quite good to hold, is to set your hardest routes first. Partly because those will be your most interesting routes, and so it's worth designing the movements that you want. So if, for instance, you're setting a volume that is quite positive, really think about a couple of key routes that you want to set on your wall, and then set those, and then from that start building your other routes around them. Sometimes, you know, you can get a volume that really dominates a set hugely, and that can be a pro and a con, because it can offer quite a unique climbing experience, and offer a lot of flexibility that you couldn't get in any other way, but also, you know, can feel a bit samey for most of your routes. So for instance, if you've got something that's quite positive and you put it right in the middle of the wall, most of your routes will be kind of navigating around that. And so it's partly why I would recommend just resetting quite often, is that you get that variety and that you're not stuck with a wall feature that kind of dominates the climbing style. But when you are setting those first harder roots, do keep in mind how much is it going to dominate the other roots. If you have a volume that's really good, perhaps you need to think about blocking it a bit or marking it out. Obviously on a home wall you get a lot more flexibility about what's in and what's out for a root. But what we have found is that you'll often want to be adding screw-ons to volumes, and that can also block a previously made root, and so you just have to keep mindful about what you're modifying as you go along.